Hello everyone, and welcome to the Jeffrey Epstein Show. I'm your host, Bobbycapucci, and this is Daily Drop number 216. Since this podcast first started, I was really digging into the financial angle of Jeffrey Epstein and his criminal operation. Now, when you start doing some digging and looking at the articles that are available for us to go through, and you look at some of the financial transactions and some of the other things that have occurred, it's quite obvious to anyone paying attention that Jeffrey Epstein not only was engaging in a child trafficking ring and a human trafficking ring, but he was involved in many financial crimes. And you can put those pieces together just by reading the articles that are available out there. When you put the pieces together and you start looking at all of the different players he was locked into and working with to get these loans and to bring money to these banks, and you start looking at the list of people that he was involved with, and you see that the ties are very strong with Jeffrey Epstein and the financial world. And I think it's a huge part of this story, and it's a part of this story that rightfully a lot of people have dug into. This is a very important aspect of what's going on here, and these financial crimes can link Jeffrey Epstein to a lot of these other players that were involved with him either loosely or that were involved with him on a more intimate basis. Because it's all about following the money, right? If you follow the money long enough, you're going to get to a destination that blows you away in situations like this. And if they use the RICO statute, they'll be able to bring everybody in who accepted $1 single from Jeffrey Epstein until they can sort out what money was ill-gotten and what money was gotten and obtained legally. So once they use the RICO statute, every single person who has ever received money from Jeffrey Epstein, even if it was a loan, can be brought in under these RICO statutes. And it's something that they use quite a bit and quite frequently within organized crime to bring down mafia and cartel type members. When they start going after your family, your wife, your children, etc., it starts putting things in a whole new perspective for you. So I think that if and when we see those RICO charges come down, I think that there's going to be a lot of people in the financial sector who are losing sleep over that. And I'm sure a lot of them have worked for or still work at Deutsche Bank. And that is what we're going to be talking about tonight. There's a new article from the New York Times, and it is going into the relationship between Deutsche Bank and Jeffrey Epstein and the ties that connected them. So let's jump into this article and see what the New York Times has brought to the table tonight. The headline: Regulators may punish Deutsche Bank for its Jeffrey Epstein ties. Banking regulators in New York have been investigating the German bank's years-long relationship with the disgraced financier. Let me fix that for you there, New York Times. Pedophile. This article was authored by Matthew Goldstein and David Enrich. Banking regulators have spent months investigating Jeffrey Epstein's dealings with Deutsche Bank, which lent money to the disgraced financier, pedophile, and held dozens of accounts for him until shortly before he died, according to 4 people briefed on the matter, but not authorized to speak publicly. And you see a lot of this in the financial world. There are a ton of leaks. When there's stories like this that are about to break or they're breaking, you'll hear a lot of people in the financial district start leaking things like this. Now, obviously, none of them are ever going to put their name to it, right, when they're leaking it. But it's pretty commonplace when you have a financial institution like Deutsche Bank being investigated for irregularities, for there to be some leaks and for people on Wall Street to talk about it within their circles and obviously leak it to the media as well. So I can totally see this occurring, and I can see the regulators really circling after the documentary, because again, no matter if we found the documentary enlightening, right? If we found it to have groundbreaking information, you can see the effect that it's having on the case just by looking at a simple Google search. And now when it comes to the people in the banking world, well, they realize they're under the microscope as well, and they understand that people are going to start digging a bit deeper, and they're going to realize that the ties between Deutsche Bank and Jeffrey Epstein are very, very intimate. So they figure these regulators are getting ahead of the curve, it looks like here, and really diving in and accelerating what they have going on. The investigation by the New York Department of Financial Services, which has not been previously reported, could result in an enforcement action against Deutsche Bank as soon as this month, before the first anniversary of Mr. Epstein's arrest on federal sex trafficking charges, the People said. And I don't have any information one way or the other. I didn't know anything about this until this article just came out, so I really can't dig much deeper than what they're talking about here. None of my sources on Wall Street had reached out to me and told me anything about this. But what I will say is that it is a bit interesting that these irregularities are being talked about right now, right? The timing is pretty interesting in my opinion. And it's telling that they're coming out right now and talking about this. And this might even have been a strategic leak by the investigators and the regulators to show people that they're being proactive in the case. Again, I don't have any evidence to prove one way or the other where the leak came from or who the source is. I'm just trying to read between the lines here and trying to see what their motivation would be for a self-leak like that. And of course, they have that motivation because they want to get ahead of the curve, right? The investigation focuses, at least in part, on the bank's decision to continue doing business with Mr. Epstein even after employees raised concerns, according to the People. Compliance officers in the bank's anti-money laundering operation alerted the federal government to several transactions in which Mr. Epstein sent money overseas in 2015, while employees worried about the reputational risks of doing business with a registered sex offender. Ultimately, senior bank executives opted to maintain the relationship with Mr. Epstein because it was so lucrative. And not only that, Jeffrey Epstein would steer business in their direction. So again, that all ties into to what I was talking about earlier with the financial aspect of this case and the RICO charges. All of these people who Jeffrey Epstein was steering towards Deutsche Bank to get them to be clients of the financial division and to get them to invest money with the bank and to get loans from the bank, etc., all of that has to be looked at with a very, very skeptical and microscopic eye, because all of these people were playing into the money laundering scheme that he had going on, right? And a lot of these enablers, folks, who were not involved with maybe not involved with the sex trafficking, were certainly involved with the money laundering aspect of it. Not all of them, but a lot of them were. So that's something that definitely needs to be discussed. It needs to be brought to the forefront, and I hope that it's an avenue that the prosecution is going down, because it's a very, 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 very important part of this case. And what it shows you is, again, that these financial institutions care much more about wealth, much more about consolidating their power, and much more about increasing their holdings than they ever did about the survivors, the rule of law, or the common person, in not even just in America, but around the world. These bankers are so absolutely corrupted that it is, you'd be hard-pressed to find people more corrupt than what you would find in the financial district. In addition to setting up dozens of accounts for Mr. Epstein, Deutsche Bank served as his lender from 2013 until last year, even as other banks considered him off limits. Deutsche Bank began extracting itself from its relationship with Mr. Epstein in late 2018 after a series of articles in the Miami Herald examined the secret non-prosecution agreement federal prosecutors reached with him in 2007. How pathetic is it that these powerful financial lending institutions such as Deutsche Bank have to be checked by a news organization like the Miami Herald and Julie K. Brown to do the right thing? Don't you think a lending institution such as they would do the right thing in the first place? That if they expect us to let them safeguard our money, the least that we can expect from them is not to be involved with a pedophile? Who is in charge of marketing in this company? Who's in charge of public relations? Whoever that person is should be fired, because holy cow. How do you have a relationship with Jeffrey Epstein? You're telling me with all of the rich people out there that are looking to bank with Deutsche Bank and to invest with you, you really needed Jeffrey Epstein's few $100 million? No, you didn't need it. but it was a profitable relationship on the back end for them. They were double dipping. Not only were they getting Jeffrey Epstein's business, but they were getting the business of all of Jeffrey Epstein's buddies and enablers. And again, it all comes down to the almighty dollar for these people. It's absolutely gross. All of them they're just so skeevy. Daniel Hunter, a Deutsche Bank spokesman, said the bank regarded its reputation as its most precious asset. Yeah, obviously, Mr. Hunter, you obviously find that your reputation is its most precious asset, considering you were doing business with a pedophile for years, even after his conviction, and even after other banks wanted nothing to do with him. Real class act, Mr. Hunter. We're really buying what you have to say here. Just be honest and say the bottom line is our most precious asset. The bottom line is all we really care about. At least you'd be honest with us. But instead, not only are you being dishonest with us, you are also enabling this man to financially maneuver and financially spread his destruction worldwide. How do these executives sleep with themselves at night? Well, I guess, you know what, I can answer that question. I guess they do it by sleeping on their piles of money that they've accumulated by helping people like Jeffrey Epstein continue their reign of terror. We regret the decision to associate with Epstein, he said. No, you don't regret the decision. You regret that you were caught. Okay, Mr. Hunter? Again, just be real. So many people fake the funk. So many people talk nonsense. Just be real. Nobody's buying your bullshit anymore. Nobody's buying it. These packaged statements where they're trying to distance themselves from Epstein and, oh, we have regrets and this, that, the other thing. The time for regret is long gone. The time for regret was after the first arrest. If you would have come out after the first arrest and been remorseful and been regretful and had all these big platitudes and all of these empty statements to share with us, at the very least, your position could have been defended. But after the fact, in 2013, you take him on as a client? Nobody's buying your half-hearted excuses, Deutsche Bank and Mr. Hunter. After Mr. Epstein was arrested last July, Deutsche Bank executives began an internal investigation into the bank's relationship with him. Folks, how many times throughout our journey here on the podcast have we talked about internal investigations and how they are straight up garbage? We really believe that Deutsche Bank is going to do a proper investigation, a proper vetting of themselves, and release the information to the public? Yeah, because that's going to be great for their bottom line. That's going to go over well in the boardroom. That's going to go over well with the shareholders. Who are they kidding? Okay? Just stop. Stop with the internal investigations. Stop gaslighting us. And stop lying every single time you make a statement. Good God. The examination includes studying how Mr. Epstein used his accounts and the bank's decision to keep him as a client, even as other banks had distanced themselves from him. Bank officials had been sharing their findings with New York regulators, according to the people briefed on the matter. The Department of Financial Services wields significant power over Deutsche Bank because the agency licenses it to operate in the state where the bank has most of its U.S. operations. So it doesn't matter. What's going to be the penalty? A hefty fine? As if they can't pay the fine. You really want to enact change? You really want to put the smackdown on one of these financial institutions? Well, I'll tell you how to do it. Get rid of their license. Really punish them. But you won't, because at the end of the day, what really matters are these financial institutions. They're the ones that get all of the leeway. They're the ones that get bailed out when shit goes wrong. Hell, they're the reason for the 2008 crisis and the crash, and yet they all find some way, they all get themselves a big fat injection of cash. We're going on day 80 in Nevada since independent contractors have seen a dime from PUA. But all of these so-called too big to fail corporations and financial institutions can play havoc with the market, play God with the market, crash it, and then expect us to bail them out? Meanwhile, we can't even rely on them not to have relationships with pedophiles. Bank officials have been sharing their findings with New York regulators, according to the people briefed on the matter. The Department of Financial Services wields significant power over Deutsche Bank because the agency licenses it to operate in the state where the bank has most of its U.S. operations. If state regulators decide to punish Deutsche Bank, it would be the latest in the series of black eyes for the bank. Federal and state authorities in recent years have imposed billions of dollars in fines on the German bank for failing to stop money laundering and for violating sanctions, among other things. The bank also has been under scrutiny by congressional Democrats and state prosecutors for its role as the longtime banker to President Trump, his family, and his companies. Look, I said this from the beginning. Instead of wasting time with this stupid impeachment hearing over Ukraine, the Democrats would have been much better served to focus their attention on Trump's finances and his financial dealings. Look, anyone who's dealing with Deutsche Bank at this point who has this kind of money is suspect, in my opinion. And instead of going off on fairy tale chases, they could have really found a little bit of red meat there and found an angle to really shake the trees. But instead, they chose a different route. When it's obvious that Deutsche Bank is involved in all kinds of money laundering, why wouldn't that be your first prong of attack? An enforcement action against Deutsche Bank would be the first taken by regulators against any of the banks that Mr. Epstein used to handle his money as he built a fortune more than $600 million, according to court filings by his estate. But other financial institutions and bankers are also being scrutinized by government officials in the United States and abroad. Well, we definitely know that Jes Staley is on the firing block. And you know I'm on record here saying that I don't think he'll outlive this COVID-19 situation. I thought he'd be gone by now. If the pandemic didn't hit, I'm pretty sure that Jes Staley would already be packing his things. But with COVID-19, the pandemic situation that gripped the world, I believe that they'll keep him around to keep the ship steady for another few months, and then it'll be off with his proverbial head, and his career will be over with Barclays because of his ties to Jeffrey Epstein. They'll spin it as something else, of course, but we all know the story. We all know the deal. The Attorney General for the United States Virgin Islands, Denise George, subpoenaed years of records from First Bank, a Puerto Rico-based lender that had provided banking services to Mr. Epstein for nearly 2 decades, according to 2 people briefed on that investigation but not authorized to speak publicly. I had heard some of the same rumblings that there was, some stuff going on down there, that Denise George was pulling some threads and she was engaged in a few different investigations. As far as the veracity of those reports, I can't really speak on that. I just heard some rumblings, so it probably has some legs that now that it's being reported here as well. There are probably several different threads that she's chasing down in the case. I mean, it would make sense. In January, Ms. George's office filed a civil forfeiture lawsuit against Mr. Epstein's estate, in which she contends that Mr. Epstein misled government officials there for nearly 2 decades and used a private island hideaway to engage in sex trafficking. Ms. George is also looking into millions of dollars of transactions conducted last year, both before and after Mr. Epstein's death, at a little-known bank that he had established in the Virgin Islands called Southern Country International. And again, this is really a big part of the financial aspect of the case. These kind of banks, these sort of shell corporations, are the way that these people wash their money. These are the kind of places that these people use to launder money and to make sure that it's hidden from the public eye. And they have a lot of success with shops like this. And you'll see a lot of them in the islands, Cayman Islands, etc., a lot of shops like this. And Jeffrey Epstein, if not for anything, the guy knew how to navigate the financial system when it comes to hiding money, right? When it comes to, ducking and dodging regulators, Jeffrey Epstein had the system gamed. And bank regulators in Britain are looking into whether James E. Staley was transparent about the details of his relationship with Mr. Epstein when describing it to officials at Barclays, where Mr. Staley became chief executive in 2015. Barclays has stood behind Mr. Staley, who has said he had no contact with Mr. Epstein after 2015. As if that matters, right? Like, oh, well, that's a feather in my cap. I haven't had any contact with the pedophile since 2015. Meanwhile, his first arrest was in 2008. So what are we supposed to give you some credit because you haven't talked to your pedophile buddy publicly? Give me a break, Staley, all right? We know that you were still talking to this dude on the low. Just like Ghislaine Maxwell and Prince Andrew were still firing off emails to each other, do you really think Jes Staley and Jeffrey Epstein just stopped talking? Or do you think they just moved it to a more private forum? Before joining Barclays, Mr. Staley was a senior executive at J.P. Morgan's Chase, where he helped cultivate the bank's relationship with Mr. Epstein. J.P. Morgan was Mr. Epstein's primary bank for more than a decade, but some bank officials became uneasy about doing business with him after his 2008 guilty plea to soliciting prostitution from a minor in Florida. J.P. Morgan cut ties with Mr. Epstein after Mr. Staley left the bank in 2013. Notice how while Jes Staley was there, they didn't cut ties. It took them cutting ties with Staley for them to cut ties with Jeffrey Epstein. And that just shows you the relationship, how rock solid it was between Jeffrey Epstein and Jes Staley. These two guys were thick as thieves. No matter what Jes Staley says, words are wind. His actions tell the whole story. We know you were on the island with Jeffrey Epstein, having a little bit of a vacation, my friend. We know how close you were. All of your canned statements and empty statements do not matter when the truth is right there for everybody to see. Why are you lying about your relationship with this man? Why don't you just come out and talk about it? Why don't you come out and defend it? Because you know you can't. You know it's indefensible. Hanging out with a pedophile who has been convicted of what Jeffrey Epstein was convicted of is an indefensible position. And all of these scumbags know it. That is when Mr. Epstein began working with Deutsche Bank. Paul Morris, a private banker who had recently arrived at the German bank from J.P. Morgan, brought Mr. Epstein on as a client, according to two of the people briefed on the matter. Mr. Morris, who left Deutsche Bank for another firm in 2016, did not respond to requests for comment, and he won't, because at their heart, all of these dudes are Charmin-hearted, right? They're all soft-hearted, marshmallow hearts. They have no courage. And those are the kind of people that hang out with people like Jeffrey Epstein. Chump-ass cowards, people with no backbone, people that won't stand up and say something when something's out of line. Those are the kind of people Jeffrey Epstein loved to hang out with, fellow travelers. The investigation could provide a rare glimpse into Mr. Epstein's mysterious finances. Mr. Epstein made a significant portion of his fortune while banking with Deutsche Bank, even though his criminal record had cost him his most lucrative client, Leslie Wexner, the billionaire retail magnate who built Victoria's Secret into a household name. Okay, I dispute that. Let's be real. It wasn't the Jeffrey Epstein's behavior that caused the relationship to fracture with Wexner. Oh no, it was just Wexner having to distance himself because of Epstein becoming toxic. You really think Wexner really was disheartened and disgusted by Epstein's behavior? Of course he wasn't. He knew exactly what sort of snake Epstein was. He knew what sort of viper that he was keeping within his home. And he did not care. Mr. Wexner gave Mr. Epstein a sweeping power of attorney to manage all aspects of his financial affairs, but said he severed ties with Mr. Epstein shortly before his guilty plea. Again, just to save face, folks. It's not because he was disgusted. It's not because he thought Jeffrey Epstein was a scumbag all of a sudden. It was because he had to save face. He had to make sure that the power that he has consolidated throughout his life did not slip through his fingers, not even one little piece of it. That's the worst thing in the world for these people, folks, for their power to disintegrate. And as far as Wexner goes, to watch L brands crumble before his eyes, I know it's horrible to say because there are far-reaching implications. A lot of good people that work for the company in retail positions are suffering. But if anyone has ever deserved to see their life's work get disintegrated before their eyes, it's this abhorrent human being, Les Wexner. While Mr. Epstein was a client of Deutsche Bank, his main business was Southern Trust Company, which generated more than $250 million in revenues during its existence, according to public records. Mr. Epstein created the company in 2013 and told government officials in the Virgin Islands that it was involved in DNA analysis and research. Ms. George, in her civil forfeiture lawsuit, contends that Southern Trust was not in his business, it claimed to be, and that Mr. Epstein misled government officials in order to win a lucrative tax break. She told the New York Times in March that her office had not yet determined the kind of business Southern Trust was in. Wow. Look, folks, it is obvious here that the financial aspect of this case is cut and dry. It's a slam dunk. And what they should do is they should bring all of these people in on financial charges to start. And once they slap them with their financial charges in the RICO case, then slap them with their RICO charges as far as the child sex trafficking goes and the sex trafficking. And then what you do is you put a nice little bow on top of all of it and you present it to the survivors. You owe them that much. If you'd like to contact me, you can do that at bobbycapucci@protonmail.com. That's BOBBYCAPUCCI@protonmail.com. If you'd like to find me on Twitter, you can do that at BOBBY_CAPUCCI. All right, everybody, we'll be back tomorrow morning with our usual morning update. Have a great night, everyone.